Hello and welcome back to my RC channel. I'm AndyRC and today I'm checking out the HX100 from BetaFPV. And up to now I haven't been that impressed with BetaFPV products, but so far I've only reviewed their whoops, which in general I find fly badly compared to their competitors, which are usually much cheaper at the same time. I think this one is going to be different though, because this is their version of what a toothpick is, and I can see some good design choices just from looking at it. However, I can also see areas where they have missed the mark, so let's take a closer look, starting off with the frame. I'm happy to see proper arms. The reason I say this is because I've noticed a trend with the toothpick models using struts and braces, which does reduce the overall weight, but whether it's flat calm or windy, there are always some prop wash oscillations. Of course, you can avoid particular maneuvers and manage the throttle so that they don't occur, or maybe you don't care about them, and that's fine as well. It's just I find flying more enjoyable when I don't have to think about those kind of things. So we can see if this style of arm makes a difference. The frame is a 2mm unibody and there is next to no flex in the arms. Its dry weight is 45 grams, so it just about ticks the toothpick box for its weight, so it would take a pretty hefty crash for the arms to break. The battery strap is good quality with a little bit of grip, but you can spot the first fail. The LiPo is going to be sitting on this front screw, and even worse, the USB connector at the back, which is obviously connected to the flight controller. So every time you strap in a LiPo, you are putting pressure on the USB connector, which in general are frail at the best of times, but it's also digging into your LiPo. So every time you land, there's not just the risk of damaging your LiPo, but also the risk of ripping off the USB connector. So then introduce a crash into that equation and it's not going to be pretty. They should have lifted the flight controller up and then put a short silicon mat underneath, which would stop the LiPo getting thrown in a crash at the same time, while still giving you access to the receiver's bind button. So onto the motors, and they are BetaFPV branded 1103 8000 kV naked bottom motors, and they are using silicon wires. They are only held in with 2 screws, and one of mine has come loose out of the box, so make sure you check all of the screws before flying. They've done something different with the props, which I'm on board with. These are the 65mm dual blade props, but you are also given some 40mm whoop props. The idea being that you run a 2S LiPo with the 65mm props and a 3S LiPo with the 40mm props. Technically, there shouldn't be much power difference between the two, but the quad blades should have more resolution than the dual blades, so on a windy day, in theory, you should get a smoother flight with the quad blades. This is one of the reasons 5-inch models went to tri-blades and quad blades, because you got smoother flying. But on the flip side, I think the 40mm props are going to rev higher, which could potentially cause more vibrations. You can also see another fail here when the 65mm props are installed. They come within millimeters of the video transmitter's antenna. Speaking of something else that will get caught in the props is the receiver's antenna. One thing that you can say about BetaFPV is that they have a variety of receiver options for all of their models. This is the FR Sky version, and they are using an XM receiver rather than the Plus version, which doesn't have the best reputation. They say its range is around half a kilometer, but in reality I'd say stick to about 120 meters. It has come flashed with the RSSI D16 firmware, so I've got to give them brownie points for that, but I cannot forgive them for this antenna dangling out the back like that. The thing is as well, if you strapped the antenna to an arm, you would get reduced range on one side, and this antenna is pretty long, so there's no excuse to put a hole in the top of the canopy and feed it through to give it equal range in all directions. The ESCs are BL Heli S set up with D-Shot 600 and rated to 12 amps. The XT30 connector has a capacitor attached to it, so it must either have some noise issues or is suffering from voltage spikes like the old Crazy Bee boards. The flight controller is built into the same board and is an F4 flash with Betaflight version 3.53. I gotta say, the setup was pretty spot on, apart from one massive problem, which was the digital idle speed. It was set to 20%. This has got to be an error, because no matter what prop you use, the model is going to lift off the ground as soon as you arm, so you're going to want to change that to about 8%. Other than that, I just changed the channel map but left everything else, including the PIDs and rates, the same, which do just look like stock Betaflight PIDs, so I'll have to see if it needs tuning. I'd also add the VTX channel to the on-screen display, but I'm gonna fly on my own today, so I just left it as it is. There's only two UARTs on the flight controller. One is for your receiver and the other is for smart audio, so you can't add anything else to it. The VTX is separate from the all-in-one board and is power switchable from 25 milliwatt to 200 milliwatt via smart audio. And the antenna placement is a complete fail for me. Again, it would have been so easy to cut a hole in the canopy to get it out of the way of the props. You would also get better reception as well. As I'm using the rapid fire module, you probably won't notice that, but with budget receivers you will get some breakup, especially when the model is facing towards you. The camera is the Runcam Nano 2, and the camera angle can be adjusted to some quite extreme angles actually, which is surprising because the cutout isn't that large. At first I thought, yes, they have nailed it by mounting the camera into a solid canopy. That was until I noticed the canopy is only mounted using 2 screws at each side and will easily rock back and forth. All it would have taken is 2 screws to secure the front and the back of the canopy, and while I don't think there will be any Giallo using the 65mm props because they won't be revving as high, with the 40mm props I'm predicting Giallo because they will be running at a higher RPM. You don't get anything else in the box other than a card with some QR codes on it. For 3S, they are recommending a 300mA LiPo, and for 2S, they are also recommending a 300mA LiPo. But those aren't equivalent in weight for the tune, neither are they equivalent for the change in prop size. It's essentially like changing the kV of the motors by switching to these different prop sizes. So my recommendation is 300mA for 3S and 450mA for 2S. The all-up weight of the model with a 300mA 3S is 72 grams, and the all-up weight with a 2S 450mA LiPo is 74 grams. Okay, let's go for a line of sight with this guy. Starting off with a 300mA 3S LiPo and the 40mm props. You can see the XM receiver antenna conveniently hanging out, ready to get caught in everything, but at least with the 40mm props, the VTX antenna is pretty much out of harm's way. So just hands off here to see if we've got any drift in angle mode. Seems to be okay. Let's check out the punch. Yeah, not bad at all. Let me give it a little bit more throttle and get it closer in. Yeah, plenty of punch. Be interesting to see what the voltage sag is like. Usually quite a lot on 3S with these small models. Now these are the stock PIDs, which I think are stock Betaflight PIDs. But I can't hear any oscillations with this battery. Of course, that sometimes shows itself when doing FPV rather than line of sight, but at least it's not oscillating like crazy. With the thing being jet black, it's pretty tricky to fly line of sight actually. One thing that antenna has going for it is that the air is pushing it down, but in a crash it could get mangled for sure. It's just simple things like that. I mean, they could have just put a hole in the top of the canopy or something to get it out of the way, and they didn't. But it's flying nice on 3S, line of sight at least, and it's got some power. Not the most powerful out of all of these style of models, and they are calling it a ToothPick. But anyways, let's bring it in for a landing. This is a line of sight flight using the 65mm dual blades and a 450 milliamp 2S GMB LiPo. Remember that the props are running props out, so be careful when switching between the two. So let's see what the punch of this one is like. Oh, it's about the same, you know. It's about the same. Oh, with the model being this dark, really difficult to fly line of sight. Yeah, about the same amount of power. Difference is I'm hearing a little bit of a zing, which is usually these propellers deflecting and vibrating, which you couldn't hear on the 40mm props. Wow, it's really floaty on these props as well. I guess there's more surface area. But yeah, not much difference between the two in terms of power. So I managed to find some sun, and this first flight was done with the 40mm props and a 300 milliamp 3S LiPo, and just as I suspected, when giving it full throttle into the sun I get a load of jello. It's not terrible, but I predicted it, so again, as the Runcam Nano is a CMOS camera, I'll add a card to the video that I made explaining why CMOS cameras suffer from jello, and hopefully some of these companies will listen to me one day. Despite that, the model flew really nice. It doesn't have breathtaking power, but it was really windy on this particular day, and those quad blades are cutting through it nicely, giving a really smooth flight. And you might also notice I'm not getting any prop wash, so I think using proper arms rather than struts is the way to go. There is one exception, which is the Tiny Hawk Freestyle. It has struts instead of proper arms, but it doesn't suffer from prop wash. However, it also has a top-mounted battery, where models like the Lava X and the Parrot 120 Pro both have bottom-mounted batteries, so the props are fighting against the low center of gravity. So I think it's why it's impossible to tune out the prop wash of those models. Other than that, there is a little bit of electrical noise in the video feed, but it might not show up on YouTube because it's very slight. And the voltage sag wasn't too bad on 3S either. The LiPo was charged to a high volt, so I got a pretty long flight time, just shy of 4 minutes, and the current meter was really accurate as well. On to 2S with the 65mm props, and just as I predicted, the jello has completely gone. The props have a bigger surface area, so they aren't getting up to the same RPM as the 40mm props, but are providing similar thrust. This flight was done directly after the 3S flight, and you will notice the model getting knocked around a little bit more. This isn't down to the tune, it's just the wind, and as I mentioned earlier, dual blade props are more susceptible to this because they don't have as much resolution as the quad blades. So would I recommend this model? And I think the answer is yes, but I still prefer the GapRC Phantom. The only advantage the HX100 has over the Phantom is the camera. Other than that, the Phantom comes with an XM Plus when you choose the FR Sky version, and it comes with a 3D printed mount and straws for the antennas. You can also mount your LiPo on the top of the frame, which comes with a non-slip silicone mat, and seeing as it also has 1103 8000 kV motors, there's nothing stopping you using 40mm props on 3S either. But the HX100 is cheaper than the Phantom, so if you like what you see, you need to do a couple of modifications when it comes to the antennas, and you need to sort out the LiPo sitting on that USB connector. But apart from that, I think this is the best BetaFPV model I've flown so far. As I charged the 450mAh 2S LiPo to a high volt, it flew for over 6 minutes on the dual blades, and that is the advantage of dual blades. They are 2 minutes more efficient than the quad blades on a 3S. So I will leave you with some flying, and if you can afford to do so, I'll link to my Patreon in the description of this video, as well as links to all of the products in this video. And as always, thanks so much for watching. Please continue to subscribe. Cheers.
Against the tide, I wanna forget you, but you pull me in. I know this ocean is far too wide. I wanna forget you, let me forget you. Push and pull, but you repel me, giving up this fight. Love and hate, we've blurred the lines. I'm giving up this fight. But I don't feel I have won. I wanna forget you, but only time will heal.